Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's program. I'm Jim Van Epps, the president of the Savannah Council, and our program tonight is entitled Science Diplomacy, a Crucible for Turning the Tide in the South China Sea, presented by Mr. James Borton, who's a senior fellow at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. And to put this in context a bit, the South China Sea, with about 650 million people in almost a dozen countries around the South China Sea, has been called the 21st century's defining battleground. It deserves our attention. To begin, our sponsor for this evening is Kreitz Auto Group, providing excellent automotive service in Savannah and the Coastal Center for about 80 years. A continuing platinum sponsor, and we're very grateful for their sponsorship. For 2022 and 2023, they are our exclusive local dealer, as you can see, for Buick, GMC, BMW, Mercedes-Benz, and Sprinter vans. So thank you once again to Kreitz. We very much appreciate our sponsors, and we welcome our members to become corporate or individual sponsors to assist us in our goal of enhancing interest in international programs, as well as providing scholarships to students traveling abroad and studying overseas. As an aside, you should know that we expect to provide scholarships to 9 students this year, including 3 who will visit Ghana this summer. We'll hear from many of them when they return. Now to our speaker. James Borton is an independent environmental policy writer and former Hong Kong-based foreign correspondent for the Washington Times. He's edited 4 books, is the author of a 5th, which is the basis of his talk this evening. And the book is offered for sale here this evening by Joni of the Book Lady, whom you passed coming in. Her store is located at 6 East Liberty. And please stop by and see Joni after this presentation this evening. Now, James was a past National Endowment of the Humanities Fellow at Yale, has been associated with other institutes and centers, and has participated in numerous South China Sea conferences. And he has co-founded the Mekong Environmental Forum, located in Vietnam. His topic: the South China Sea is a unique area, supporting human life and is a natural laboratory for ocean research and exploration, which today focuses and faces a serious problem because of mounting environmental degradation due to climate change, ocean acidification, plastics pollution, reclamations, fisheries collapse, coral reef destruction, and increased maritime traffic. The failure to resolve the South China Sea crisis is a harbinger of ecological disaster. Dotted with atolls, coral reefs, and islets, it's moored in disputed territorial claims among and between China, Vietnam, Taiwan, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Brunei. Environmental cooperation appears to remain the only viable pathway to address these issues. Now, following his presentation this evening, James will take our questions, so please join me in welcome to the podium Mr. James Borton.
Thank you, Jim. I think I'll just go forward here. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Jim, and members of the Savannah World Affairs Council for this generous invitation and opportunity to speak with you. There is a storm blowing in the South China Sea, and I think it's followed me here in Savannah tonight. Let's be clear about that. No region will be more important to global peace and prosperity in the coming years than the Indo-Pacific region, which has more geopolitical hotspots, emerging powers, overlapping political and economic partnerships, and risk of conflict than any other. As a researcher and environmental policy writer, I've been reporting on that area for the better part of 3 decades. I regard myself also as a sailor and a waterman. The ocean means everything to me. I've been fortunate to stand on the shoulders of marine biologists and oceanographers who've given me a lens, a broad lens to look out into these turbulent waters that you've been reading about and listening about in the South China Sea. But why should Washington or why should Americans care about a dispute over atolls and rocks and reefs half a world away? The answer lies in economics, power politics, and natural resources. To be clear, there's no clear path for the resolution of the complex wrangling over who owns what rock, what reef, and where this body of water and region accounts for at least a third of the global maritime trade, estimated to be in excess of $5 trillion in trade flows, and where huge oil and gas natural reserves are said to lie beneath the water, and where it was once regarded as a great fishing ground for the world. This sea connects the Pacific Ocean to the Indian Ocean, allowing trade from all of these East Asian countries to flow to billions of people. But without access to the South China Sea, the transport of those products, our products from Walmart that we use every day, would slow down, the supply chains broken, and they would cost exorbitant prices. We do need open and trade flows. But few disputes have attracted more controversy and intrigue during the past several years than the South China Sea. There's an environmental drama unfolding in real time in these troubled waters, and the crime scene, I've described it in many editorials, op-eds, extends to coastal areas, coral reefs, and collapsing fisheries. I want to introduce you to this natural and unique lab for ocean research and exploration. And yet, this rifted basin, dotted with these atolls and corals and islets, is mired in disputed territorial claims between China, Vietnam, Taiwan, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Brunei. But despite the roiling waters, the rising tensions, and the mistrust in the region, the growing threats to ecological security just may offer a kind of a promising gateway to cooperative oceanographic research, peace, and prosperity. Writ large, the ocean commons is a new way to express a very old idea, that some forms of wealth belong to all of us, and that these community resources must be actively protected and managed for the good of all. In this presentation, I will lay out a navigational chart for why we need to tap down the rising tensions and take urgent action in marine environmental cooperation. Access to fish stocks and the conservation of biodiversity in the South China Sea is fast becoming one of the signature conflicts of the 21st century. And this presentation frames a kind of environmental security issue in the region that's supported by evidence of direct violations of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, commonly referred to as UNCLOS. And it recognizes that the present situation is one of significant environmental concern for all of us. Let me go to a map so we know exactly what we're talking about here. The South China Sea, you can see, is contained two major groups of features. Let's see if I'll use this. And we have, of course, the Spratly Island. We have the Paracels and the Spratlys here. And the Paracels in the northern half of the sea are really controlled largely by China, but also claimed by Taiwan and Vietnam. And the Spratlys to the south are far smaller, more dispersed, and even more contested by these nations. The conventional wisdom is that China claims sovereignty over virtually all of the South China Sea islands and their adjacent waters. Its claims are sweeping and more expansive than any of its rival claimants. Since 2014, the People's Republic of China has continued to assert claims to a wide swath of this body of water, including a right to draw baselines and closing of internal waters within 4 geographic dispersed groups of islands. At the end of World War II, no country was explicitly granted sovereignty over these waters, and China asserted its advantage by submitting the now infamous 9-dash line, we see reflected here, claiming coverage over almost the entire South China Sea. International law and marine life is under siege in this body of water. And today I'm here to ask you to understand how science, specifically how a science policy process can be used and enhanced as part of a renewed diplomacy effort to mitigate the destruction of coral reefs, address increased pollution, and control and manage the overfishing in the region. We need now more than ever a kind of rules-based ecological approach. And so enter science diplomacy. We know that the globalization has considerably enhanced and extended the importance of science and technology in international relations. So my talk really reaffirms that the South China Sea can become a body of water that unites rather than divides nations. We need to place marine conservation, cooperation, and with it science and technology at the center of activities and embrace the tool of science diplomacy. Well, I've given you some definitions here that science can inform foreign policy decisions. It promotes international scientific collaborations. It eases tensions between nations and improves international relations. But mind you, this is not a completely new approach to international relations in general, and the South China Sea dispute management in particular. However, at this moment, it seems that this type of diplomacy has raised two important questions. Namely, should we do it, and can it be successful? Let's be clear. I think science diplomacy offers the potential to, let's call it, denationalize the scientific research. Historically, science diplomacy has contributed to solving many transboundary water issues. This includes also what we experienced in the Arctic, and the Arctic Council was formed between competing nations. We also have seen this in the Mediterranean. We had the Mediterranean Action Plan. We've even seen it in the Red Sea in terms of Israel and Jordan and other countries, all understanding that they share this body of water in terms of addressing transboundary water issues. As a result, science diplomacy provides claimants and other parties involved with an effective way to evaluate the political willingness of other partners and policymakers. It establishes a useful and convenient starting point for regional cooperation to deal with not only international environment problems, but it also brings together marine scientists and oceanographers from other claimant nations where they share a common language. It goes beyond national borders. I've had the opportunity to see this firsthand in terms of participating in a couple of these workshops where there have been mainly marine scientists and oceanographers present with a few policymakers in the room to discuss these transboundary water issues. I want to take you to this, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and briefly just highlight the importance of this, because the General Assembly of the United Nations declared that the area of the seabed and the ocean floor, beyond the limits of national jurisdiction, as well as its resources, are the common heritage of mankind, of all of us, and that the exploration and the exploitation of which should be carried out for the benefit of us, for mankind. So the global commons have been traditionally defined as those parts of the planet that have fallen outside national jurisdictions and to which the nations have access. International law defines 4 global commons, namely the high seas, yes, the atmosphere, Antarctica, and outer space. Article 123 of this law, UNCLOS, provides that states should cooperate with each other to coordinate the management and the conservation, the exploration, and the exploitation of all living resources in the sea. And it's through their scientific research policies and the protection and the preservation of the marine environment is assured. After all, these states are bound by the obligation to prevent transboundary environment harm. Let me really briefly read a passage from my book here as I jump into this. The freedom of the oceans of the world and coastal waters has surely proven to be a contentious issue in international law for the past 500 years. The most influential and noted argument in favor of open navigation, trade, and fishing was that espoused by politician, shipwreck survivor, and Dutch jurist Hugo Grotius in these words: "Let no man possess what belongs to every man." In July 2016, the Permanent Court of Arbitration hearings held at Hague Tribunal Court, they made a decision that all of China's claims in the South China Sea were false. There was no historical basis for them. The Hague ruling stated that China failed to conduct an environmental assessment of its reclamation activity. I'm going to take you to those charts and data in terms of what they were doing in the South China Sea to the coral reefs. And the tribunal's landmark award ruled that China has breached all of its obligations to not cause harm to the marine environment. In other words, it violated, mankind's share of that commons, that we all participate in the preservation and conservation of it. So basically the ruling, the Permanent Court of Arbitration demolished all of China's claims for the vast majority of the South China Sea. But what we're seeing now is kind of an ecological catastrophe. The rich natural heritage, the biodiversity is facing new challenges and dangers. Overfishing, habitat destruction has directly contributed to biodiversity loss, and it's getting worse each day. Reclamations destroy coral reefs. 80% of all of South China Sea's extraordinary coral reefs are now degraded. Marine plastic debris continuing to escalate. Agricultural and industrial runoff polluting the coastal regions. And for any of you who've traveled in China, you know that the entire coastal region of China is a dead zone. There is no marine life to be found there. Fortunately, there are marine scientists like my friend at the University of Miami, Professor John McManus, who for the last 25 years has been conducting sweeping marine surveys in these contested waters, in the Spratlys and the Paracels. I participated with him in a number of conferences where he has identified the severe damage done by China in terms of its reclamations of these atolls and rocks. According to him, roughly 100 square miles of reefs have been destroyed by China's base building. That's huge. China stopped these large-scale reclamations in 2018, but satellite images show some parts of the South China Sea are still being built up. Well, how do we link this environmental security with regional and international security? I mean, the concept of environmental security represents a kind of a crucial effort to link the impact of environment to national and international. There is a global food security issue here. The collapse of the fisheries in the region impacts about 1.9 billion people. China, Indonesia, the Philippines, Vietnam, Sri Lanka are the top 5 most plastic polluting states in the world. And since the 1960s, fish declined from 50% to 487, 238 species. What does this matter? China has promised its citizens a goal of food self-sufficiency, but with 20% of the world's population and only 9% of the world's arable land, this state of security seems completely out of reach. Communities all around the South China Sea are highly dependent on the fish stocks for both food security and local livelihoods. Yet the region has seen catch rates plummet in recent years because of overfishing. Think about this. based on the current global fish consumption trends, and with a global population now, 8 billion, and expected to increase to, 9.7 billion in the next 2 decades, every species of wild-caught seafood, from tuna to sardines, will collapse by the year 2050. Now, how many of us had fish tonight for dinner? Take a look at this chart in terms of the red dots here. They represent depleted fisheries, and it's getting worse each day as the ocean continues to be plundered. We're seeing collapse, the collapse of those fisheries, and along with that, we're seeing a rise of this, what I call it, the South China Sea nationalism, and with that, accompanying that is kind of a fishing nationalism. That is, the fishery issues and the national security concerns are driven by resource and sovereignty imperatives. So there's a real potential for fishing nationalism to take hold as resources and sovereignty disputes are intertwined. This is an example picture of China's fishing fleet, part of it. The figures are astounding when you think that around 12% of the global fish catch comes from the South China Sea, which also hosts more than half of the world's fishing vessels. So, however, these fishery resources are being exploited at such a harrowing rate, and there's an increase in illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing. You can see this map a little better in terms of the rate at which China is taking its catch of totaling about 4.6 million tons per year, about 12 times more than is reported to the United Nations. Now, China's flotilla of fishing trawlers are traveling to other waters, including Papua New Guinea. We know about off the coast of Africa. And of course, now they're sending their fishing fleet to our own territory, the Federated States of Micronesia, Guam, Saipan, right there where the 7th Fleet is. They have purchased their commercial fishing license from those island communities, and they're taking run of the water, if you wish, there. So, as I mentioned earlier, what we're seeing is this collapse. Since 85% of the world's fishers reside here in Asia, China alone has about 2,000 blue water trawlers and over 500,000 motorized fishing vessels, steel-hulled, plundering, plowing the ocean. Increasing number of conflicts over these ancestral fishing grounds are occurring daily. We don't read about them. I had the opportunity in 2018 to board out of Da Nang, a Vietnamese fishing trawler, and travel out to the Spratlys as far as safe as we could, but of course we were met by China's militia flotilla of fishing vessels, these steel-hulled vessels that often ram Vietnamese, Indonesian, Malaysian fishing trawlers. Another part of this picture of why we need to inject science and science diplomacy is what is going on with our coral reef and the damage constructed by not only China, but Vietnam and other claimant nations. They've all taken these dredgers and chopped up the coral, and the construction of artificial islands expanded from 500 acres in 2014 to about 3,200 in 2016. So, as I said, China is not the only country to reclaim the land. Others are in violation. So the landfill upsets the marine ecology of the region, and it destroys coral reefs that were formed 1 million years ago, not to be recovered. These mega dredgers destroy corals. China is estimated to have consumed more sand in the past 3 years than the U.S. consumed or used in the entire 20th century. So 60% of the sand use worldwide is in China. They have dredgers that can extract over 4,500 cubic yards of sand and rock from the seabed in an hour. They have 200 of these dredgers. I'm going to show you a picture of one in just a moment. And they've dredged and blasted material onto these living reefs. That is one of their mega dredgers. I think it's you'd have to call it a kind of coral reef killing machine. And this is the result. We're seeing more and more of the coral reefs that are dead, not only in terms of attributed to the reclamation process, chopping up the corals and pouring concrete over it and building military installations, but we're also seeing change that we've been reading about in terms of the climate and ocean acidification. Even the Great Barrier Reef has suffered. Actually, we'll ask Jim more about that since he just returned from Australia. I've not been there. So while countries like China feed their appetites for sand, and the soaring extraction has come at an alarming price, so we have vanishing islands, shrinking rivers, and collapsing ecosystems. So more than half of the Earth's coral reefs have died in the last 50 years. But what can be done? Well, we come back to it. Inner science diplomacy. Without agreement on any of the many environmental problems, there's a bleak future for the sea. I think we need to see this marriage of policy and science, and it's essential for navigating these perilous geopolitical passages. Science diplomacy is not a novel or new approach to international relations, but the timing for dispute management and the use of science diplomacy is more urgently needed now more than ever. So ocean science has been adopted as kind of a diplomatic tool for peace building, since scientific evidence informs negotiations and fosters joint marine research capacity building. There have been, even at the end of COVID, actually November 2020, during COVID, China hosted a conference on this idea of science diplomacy, inviting oceanographers, marine scientists. A month later, Vietnam did the same thing. They hosted that in Da Nang, inviting again claimant nations to address some of these same issues that I've outlined this evening. So we see this convergence of science and geopolitics, and I think it really necessitates the expansion of these kind of scientific forums. We need more dialogue and conversation. Right now, we know that relations between Washington or Beijing are at their lowest ebb, and we're not having that much conversation these days. I think science and scientists can start to pick up and renew that conversation that's essential. Science interest and environmental objectives can strengthen diplomacy, and we need that diplomacy now. So after all, the marine biologists, the oceanographers, they kind of share this common language that kind of cuts across the political, the economic, and the social differences. I'd like to read this one passage from my book that may illuminate this a little bit more clearly. I reached out to a number of Chinese marine biologists, oceanographers, to get their views in writing this book. Reached out to them. Unfortunately, I was not allowed to travel to China, but I'm not going to, that's another story. I couldn't get in this time, so I used email. But let me read something to you. For example, Dr. Yu Weidong at Sun Yat-sen University School of Atmospheric Sciences readily endorses ocean science cooperation as the best way to move forward in the collection and in the stimulation of common interest in the region to address the challenges of ocean science cooperation. And now I quote him. He wrote, I sent him 3 or 4 questions. This was one of his responses. I have some experience working with partners in the region, mainly through the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission for the Western Pacific." Quote, end of quote. Along with others that I received messages from, he knows that the challenge of climate change, extreme weather, climate disaster, and disruptions in marine ecosystems will require collaboration. We're seeing examples of marine science research in the area. The Joint Marine Scientific Research in the South China Sea actually started 1996 through 2006. The Philippines and Vietnam had a marine science vessel. They were going out into the contested waters, examining the coral reef damaged structures, and also conducting numerous other scientific studies. It has just been renewed. They're going to start that again this year in the fall, these joint scientific marine expeditions. I'm encouraged by that. And of course, U.S. and China have an ocean partnership. Well, we haven't been hearing that on any of the news channels, but it does exist. While we have these major obstacles, whether it be trade, tariffs, and intellectual property, and the list goes down, there is cooperation that is going on in terms of the seas and the ocean. There's plans for a network marine protected area in the region. Let me read what my friend Dr. McManus shared with me about this. I think he's someone I have a great deal of respect for, and he told me, he writes, actually we're at a conference, and this is a redaction of what he shared with the participants. I was one of them. He says, "There's this thing that China only deals bilaterally, and that does come up when they talk about oil exploration. I looked around, and it turns out China is part of 17 or more land, environment, and transboundary agreements. Otherwise, they want to protect the environment, and one of those involved 4 countries. They have a history of doing multilateral agreements. China is involved in several international fishery organizations as well. So it's not out of the picture that China could do this. It's just that with any country, it kind of depends on who you talk to and who happens to be making the decisions. But I do think it's possible. China does have relationships all over, but all the scientists across Southeast Asia and China tend to agree. They're very distressed about the damage to the coral reefs. They're worried about the fisheries collapsing, and they don't have enough of the data sharing to know for sure what the status of some of these things are, and certainly not enough to monitor so we can protect the spots. So all of the scientists know this as well, that there are lots and lots of conservationists in China, and they tend to be very brave individuals because sometimes you have to be careful of what you say." Here's some recommendations that I've suggested to some of my friends in Washington, that we create a kind of ASEAN development of a South China Sea Blue multilateral commission, that we begin to conduct these joint marine science surveys into the Spratly Islands. That's one of the reasons that, I had a friend of mine, a designer, come up with this logo, this imposed marine science vessel flying the flags of the claimant nations. I think we can develop joint marine science ecosystem monitoring and apply these scientific results to kind of a comprehensive ocean management environmental security plan. We need to create more marine protected areas so that the ecosystems can regain their actual function and populations can be bolstered and habitats protected, so there will be enough fish to feed those people in all of the ASEAN nations. Those coastal nations depend on the fisheries. Why not call for an international marine peace park right in the middle of the Spratlys? McManus and other marine scientists that I've spoken to, they've been calling for this for some time. They literally set aside the sovereignty disputes, the sovereignty claims, the nationalism that exists, and take a piece of the Spratly Islands and use that as a peace park for cooperative science management, research. If you wish, the idea that science indeed can help shape policy formation. That's the ideal behind a peace park. I think also let's use the kind of a social media global campaign to kind of save the South China Sea from its exploitation, and to understand that we need to develop this kind of blue mindset to share the commons. There's some promising areas of cooperation. I think we're seeing a network now of marine protected areas, data systems to promote transparency in fisheries management, seafood traceability, certification and standards. Although tonight I didn't ask them where the fish came from. I had a good dinner. I should have asked about that seafood traceability. The assessment of environmental sustainability of aquaculture development, oceanic, atmospheric, and typhoon monitoring. I think we need to support these science policy interactions and recognize that science is a crucial but bounded aspect in water resource decisions. Understand that this is a group process and it's linked to science policy interactions. We need to map these ecologically important coastal habitats, and we need to engage boundary organizations and supporting informal networks. And that includes civil society. And might I add, in terms of the civil society, and this is in authoritarian or communist regimes, Vietnam, China, there is an emergence of what I call a citizen science network. That is, the young people, they are concerned chiefly about all the things that I've gone over in terms of the overfishing, the pollution, the damage to the coral reefs. They are really concerned because, one, they're going to need that security, that food security, but they also understand the importance of the ocean to their almost national identity. You take away the sea, let's take, for example, Vietnam. It's seacoast. If there was no East Sea for Vietnam, they really wouldn't be Vietnamese in terms of their national identity. So the sea, the preservation, the conservation among the young people is vital. I like this image. I think this is the kind of image that makes us think about, well, why this matters. Healthy coral system, fish. One last passage here from my book, which is the beginning of the book. The voices of these marine scientists and the fishermen remind us that we must protect all the parts of the systems on which we depend. From the smallest ecosystem to the hermit crabs I have seen on Kula Cham, which is an island 25 nautical miles off the central coast of Vietnam. 1,000 inhabitants, they're all fishermen, their coral reefs are pristine. Pristine. No plastic allowed, no hotels, no motels on that. It's all homestay. If a fisherman has a bad day, well, his neighbor's going to give him some fish. They are connected to the ecosystem. It makes me think that maybe James Cameron in Avatar, The Way of Water, might have gone to that particular island community. They understand what it means to conserve and preserve their ecosystem. Rachel Carson's seminal, The Sea Around Us, a book I've taught to Coastal Carolina University marine science students, reminds us that we must be faithful stewards of the sea. I think science can help guide us and maybe transform us from being a species that uses up its resources to one that cherishes and nurtures them. For now, I'd like to think the tide may be lifting the possibility for science research surveys above the geopolitical noise and the fray of sovereignty claims. Okay, yeah, highly recommended. You know, my publisher said you must use this opportunity to sell your book. Okay, well, here it is. I really want to thank you for your time and attention, and I'm really interested in your questions this evening, and I hope I can answer them. So thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, thank you.
I'm going to sneak around in
Sure,
front of you here.
Sure.
Great, thank you, James. I appreciate and we appreciate your presentation this evening and enhancing something that, frankly, I would say that my wife and I, anyway, had very little understanding of, so thank you. I would not generalize on behalf of all of us here, couple things I'd like to ask you before we start, and one of them was the definition of ASEAN. You use that term. Could you explain what ASEAN means, please?
Sure. The Southeast Asian Nations Association is comprised of actually, 10 nations. Can you hear me? Okay, can you hear me here? You have to hold this thing up to me? Okay. Okay, got it now. Okay. ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, comprised of 10 nations, really representing about 600 to almost 650 million people who are engaged in attempted cooperation, and it does address environment, but also politics too, transboundary water issues, a number of other issues. So it is an association that, for the most part, has, until very recently, been in the shadow, their giant neighbor, China. But they're now beginning to stand up, to be more unified. And I think that offers some promise and potential.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
And one more before I reach out to you, and that is, I want to go to slide number 2, and so how am I going to do that without? Yeah, there we go. If you could just talk about something that is known as the 9-dash line, which is very important in that area, and I believe it's shown as a solid line. But could you explain that, please?
Sure. Maybe I'll use this too.
Okay.
Maybe it's darkest line on there.
Yes, exactly. Can you hear me now? Okay. Yes. After World War II, as I mentioned, Japan ceded any claims that it had to this body of water, and China reached into its history books, very old history books, and they made this claim that indeed, even extending beyond their coastal, this is their coastal line here, that this was all part of their natural heritage, that their fishermen claim these atolls and rocks and islands as part of their history. So they're arbitrarily set up this kind of what I call a 9-dash line that the the Hague Tribunal, really dismissed as being bogus. There was no justification and no foundation for this claim to this part of the South, actually for the greater part of the South China Sea. And of course, they rebuked the tribunal's ruling. There has been no resolution on that. In effect, the international rule of law has failed in terms of China making any effort to respond in the international court decision, the Hague Tribunal. So it has just been dormant. There is another possibility that the Philippines and Vietnam are going to take China to the court again, but there has been no real effort, and we come back even to, you mentioned ASEAN and what that represents, for them to stand up and tell China, you continue to do wrong, and part of that is how they've claimed this great part of the South China Sea with no history, no historical foundation.
In essence, just continuing on what James said, this line that comes down here like this is known as the 9-dash line, and it simply was a map that they drew and it happened to be 9 dashes, and China said everything within that is ours. And so that's, it goes beyond this class in James's book, an understanding of the 9-dash line, because that's an internationally contested understanding that's been projected by China. And as James said, the Hague National Tribunal says it doesn't work.
Yeah. And so many conferences have been held by legal experts, international law experts on this. I am not one of those legal experts, I can tell you that, but I have listened to them. And so it is an ongoing international legal battle that continues, and many conferences and forums are held on the subject of what constitutes China's claims and how they have violated UNCLOS.
So are there any questions? Susan?
Thank you. You've made a very compelling case for the necessity of cooperation, monitoring, and protection. But given the failure of international law and the power of sea nationalism, who's going to pay? Where will the funds come to sort of bring policy and science together?
It's a very good question. And I'm not naive enough to think that this is going to happen overnight, but I think the consensus is among the scientific community. There are more and more ranking notable marine scientists, just as there are probably far more international lawyers addressing ocean issues than there are marine science voices. Nevertheless, I think there can be a convergence there. They can bring policymakers together. I would like to believe that in terms of the United Nations, that they could create a commission, which they have not done to date, to bring together, as I suggested, a kind of blue water commission on the South China Sea. Maybe the first step, as I've said before, is to have conversation and dialogue. Can we force China to come to the table? No, but I think, as I've shared with you, there's more and more marine scientists, China, who are really concerned about the looming global food security issue. That is the reason why China is sending out these mega trawlers to Papua New Guinea, off the coast of Africa. They are plundering the ocean to feed their, 400 million middle-class citizens? They need to have their fresh fish. Those citizens there keep things stable. And of course, they're sending the same vessels out into the Pacific Islands. How can they bring together some kind of coalition? I'm just hopeful that we don't have to wait for a kind of a doomsday scenario. That is, war can be avoided. Have countries ever gone to war over water, rights, or food? So we want to avoid that for sure. And I think the interjection of scientists and marine scientists specifically into that conversation will help tap down those tensions. I don't think it's something that a lot of policymakers are taking under consideration, and yet there are some stellar examples of oceanographers cooperating. As I mentioned, the Mediterranean Action Plan, the Red Sea, even in the Arctic Council, where you have Russia is still part of that, by the way, and the United States. So, I have some learned friends who say, "Hey, James, you're kind of Pollyannish. You're kind of naive to think that no, I don't think there's anything naive about science. Science is real, and I believe that those voices will be heard now more than ever, and that's what we need. And I think as citizens who live here in this beautiful city of Savannah River, you appreciate the aquatic life, the natural resources that are here, and it takes political will. It takes political will, granted, even here at the local level, to maintain and preserve your beautiful water. So I'm witnessing, even in those authoritarian states, as I mentioned, a rising tide of young people who are environmentalists. And maybe they haven't read Rachel Carson or Silent Spring, but they want to protect their oceans and their water system.
Thank you. Is there another question?
You certainly present a really clear picture of a disaster just around the corner here, and so one of the things that I wanted to ask you, how did the scientific cooperation in the Antarctic with multiple nations, how did that get funded and come together?
The so-called competing nations did pony up money for their cooperation and science efforts. That included Russia. And now, by the way, you try to answer that as comprehensively as I can, but now China is a part of that dialogue. Of course, they have lots of money to contribute, but they're they're not necessarily taking the lead there. But it's a shared, there's shared contributions from those nations involved in the Arctic Council in the examination of marine science issues there. I'm not an Arctic specialist, but I've talked to Dr. Paul Berkman, who is at Tufts and heading up part of the research there in the Arctic. And he's informed me that indeed those nations that were involved did contribute funds for the marine science research vessel, for the surveys that are being conducted. And there seems to be that level of cooperation. Now granted, the ice is melting and definitions, the landscape is, seascape is changing. There are marine resources there too, for sure. So we're going to see, we can have competition and cooperation in the same place, in the same moment, maybe. And maybe it's the idea of fixing those two. They are ideas that are in opposition, but they can be in alignment too. So I believe that as we move forward into this century, that, in terms of, mining the sea, minerals, also pharmaceutical aspects, all that's going to be taking place. Is it going to be done on a national base? Nationalism is going to surface over cooperation. Naturally that's going to be a big factor there, but I still think that the voices, that is the cooperation among the marine scientists, may be able to nudge policy in a more positive, cooperative manner. That's my hope. That's what I would like to see realized.
There's a question right there.
Why does it always have to be just marine scientists when we're talking about a lot of things from the ocean impact health issues and things like that? Why not combine with scientists like the World Health Organization and all the scientists that are more or less working to a better environment for the whole world?
Well, absolutely. We are talking about the exploration of the ocean, and indeed I'm sure that the epidemiologists even there in Atlanta are communicating with oceanographers on a daily basis. There is, I just primarily share the belief that those scientists are, as I said, have the same common language, whether it be an epidemiologist or an oceanographer. And of course the mission here is not to plunder the ocean, but to explore it, not to exploit it, but also to explain it. That's what we should, be thinking about. And exploitation, by the way, how many of you saw James Cameron's latest film, Avatar: The Way of Water? Okay. Yes, he's more didactic and more preachy than I am tonight, for sure. But he had a narrative to tell, and it's the same story I'm just shared, the facts I shared with you tonight. That's why I made reference. I actually wrote an op-ed about that, comparing his film to what I discovered on this island called Kula Cham, which means paradise. Because I'm sure that Cameron, he is, by the way, first of all, an oceanographer. He's a scientist, first, an explorer. The Explorers Club in New York City, 3,300 international explorers, including Buzz Aldrin, space exploration, and of course, our oceans, the Himalayas. I think the idea is that there's opportunity for the science communities, to answer your question, yes, plural communities, to help inform policy. And that's what I see the steady narrative is unfolding more and more. And thankfully, we're seeing the dramatization through, films like Avatar, of course, all that digitally enhanced thing. I actually was in March, I went back to Vietnam with a film crew, 2 Chicago-based filmmakers, husband and wife team of 36 years together, making documentary films on the environment, including Antarctica and Patagonia and elsewhere. Went to Kula Cham, made a documentary about this island. Record time, got all the approvals from the Communist Party to go in there with the film crew, because Vietnam wants to tell its story about what they're doing in a marine protected area. They want all of their neighbors, ASEAN neighbors, to know this. They want China to know this too. And it's a good story.
Yes.
Why is there so many millions of dollars being spent to make sure America doesn't ratify the law of the sea? I mean, do you remember what year it was created? You know how long it's been? And every single defense person who's tried to get it ratified, there's always people in Congress who are brought up by certain lobbyists. What is the rationale?
I wish I could understand that myself, sir, and it's a very important question. Yes, we're the only, 162 nations have ratified, the Convention, the Law of the Sea. The United States has not. I cannot, for the love of me, give you a comprehensive, intelligent response. There may be someone else here who'd like to weigh in on this. I know we have some ocean stewards here and captains and people engaged, but why has that not happened?
Well, it made a tremendous difference if America had ratified it. I'm sorry, forget it. I didn't understand.
The what ifs, yeah, the what ifs. But I don't. Your question is well taken, and I wish I could give you some substantive and really intellectually enhanced response to that. I'm frustrated by that. I've written some op-eds regularly why we should ratify, but no one seems to be hearing that. That's even I was trying to reach the conservatives during the Trump administration. I write for the Washington Times, and to no avail. Yes.
Yes, Ms. Rowe.
I just, as a political scientist, or someone who's ABD but not PhD yet, when you talk about marine biologists, the fact that marine biologists are needed because there's certain equipment that only marine biologists would be able to utilize. So look at those bifurcation lines historically and see how the world has changed and how the different maps and historics and how the land mass and even the ocean has changed within a certain amount of time over the last couple hundred years. That I, as a political scientist, wouldn't be able to do, but as a marine biologist, they would know how to look at using the equipment and go in and make a proper analysis that maybe even an oceanographer wouldn't be able to do. So I would say that marine biologists would be needed in order to gather that information, give it to policymakers, and be able to legally and politically look at the emphasis of what that information would provide. So I just wanted to.
No, thank you very much for those comments. I think we're witnessing even a kind of an interdisciplinary approach born out of necessity in trying to look at trying to solve this issue. I mean, it is a geopolitical issue that seems, in terms of the sovereignty claims, almost intractable. China doesn't seem to be making any moves, and yet there is an urgency here.
Are there any pressures developing that would lead China to believe that it's in its own best interest to be more in sync with what you're thinking?
Well, let me see. Unfortunately, they've had the resources to build more and more vessels, mega trawlers, and they have the greatest fishing fleet, to say nothing about what they've done on the military side of their Navy. But I'm not focusing on the military, defense tonight, more the environment. But they have so many trawlers, thousands and thousands, and the subsidies that they offer. So they've been able to go, as I said, to far shores. I'm just surprised that Washington, our congressmen, our senators, for the last year and a half, China has been sending its ships through right there in front of the 7th Fleet. I did communicate, by the way, with the public affairs commander at the 7th Fleet and was hoping to board a vessel to go out on some of their freedom of navigation exercises. But I asked them, why haven't you had any interdictions with the Chinese fishing coming right off the coast of Guam, Federated States of Micronesia, Saipan? This is part of American territory. They said that's not our mission, and that those ships have purchased their commercial fishing licenses, and they're doing things according to the letter of the law. And the islands themselves have sort of caved in to the financial largesse of selling those licenses. And as a result, there is no more artisan fishermen there. The fishermen, the islanders, are not finding the fish. China's taken all of it.
So what would you recommend the 7th Fleet do?
Well, you know, I would think they would just show some presence, and the presence is they've stayed in port, and they go out on their freedom of navigation exercises, which you read about or hear on mainstream media, and period. In the meantime, China's plundering, taking the fish. Talk to the people in those federated states of Micronesia. They can't find the fish. The tuna, it's gone and going. Only this year, February, this year, did the U.S. Coast Guard finally deploy vessels that are now out there, and they are attempting to kind of, I won't even say corral, but they're running a little bit more interference for the first time in terms of looking at any illegal, unreported fishing activity. But China, as I said, has covered its bases. They have their commercial fishing license, and besides, they've paid off the local island communities and made big contributions and infrastructure commitments, et cetera. So it's only been recently in the last 4 or 5 months that we have sent U.S. Coast Guard out there to see if they can interdict in some way. But someone, please inform me, why wouldn't the 7th Fleet show some presence? And I didn't get a good answer from the public affairs commander from the 7th Fleet on that.
I think there's a last question right here. I'm sorry.
I'm 100% with you on the importance, but I think you got to go back to 1421. You got to look at the way China was intimidated by the British and said we're no longer ever going to surrender the seas. They have real strong feelings about this stuff, and you know, I think I hate to be the doomsday kind of person, but I think we've got to get real, and they ain't going to back off, and then it's going to get worse. And so I don't know what we do about it getting worse, but you know, as we know, even in the military sense, well, you really have to look back to the Opium War and all that history to understand where they're coming from, and they have a huge determination that never again be intimidated by any other country on the sea.
I do not disagree with you. I think your historical reference point is well taken, and that humiliation that they experienced, particularly during the Opium Wars, is very much part of their kind of character formation. There's no question about that. 20 years ago, I made the mistake. I was reporting. I was living in Hong Kong. I had an assignment from the Washington Times, by the way, to get into China. I decided to go in as a tourist. I didn't have didn't apply. I flew to Shanghai. First day, I had a couple of appointments, interviews, and always 10 o'clock at night, security's knocking at your door. You know, you read about the journalist, pack your bags, come with us. Well, okay, I'm in Shanghai. No, you're going to get in on a plane, you're going to Beijing. So I was detained about 48 hours. And I had the series of interviews with someone with the Ministry of Culture and Information, which I knew he spoke perfect English, but we had a translator. And at the end of that harangue, him talking, lecturing about the rule of law, he extends his hand, he says, "Does might make right, Mr. Borton?" I said, "No, but size matters." And it was détente. He smiled, I smiled, and he says, "Don't come back to my country."
Last question there.
Borton, I was recently on an online discussion with our ambassador to China, Nick Burton.
Oh, yes.
And he was getting hit pretty hard by some of the questions, saying, you don't have very good access in Beijing. You can't talk very broadly to the Chinese, can you really, in this environment, which is a product of, the nature of the relationship right now. So if you had something to say to Nick Burns about, first of all, theoretically, it's easier to talk about this stuff than it would be to talk about Uyghurs, human rights, or, you know, and arming Russia, or whatever the case may be. But you all, so what's your advice to Nick Burns? And secondly, could, instead of we making the pitch about, you know, activating organizations or forming new organizations about maritime conservation in the area, could you get the others, the Vietnams, the Malaysias, the Brunei, and the Philippines to invite the Chinese to this or that discussion in which we would participate? Because anything coming from us presumably would be, well, you're just doing that to harm us in some kind of way.
Yeah, thank you for that question. First of all, it'd be very presumptuous me to advise the distinguished Ambassador Burns about geopolitics. Let me say that first. It would be foolish. But if I had the opportunity to have a conversation with him or have a cup of coffee, I would say, yes, we have this low-hanging fruit here. It's really, really important fruit where it's non-acrimonious in terms of getting U.S. and China to have a dialogue. My suggestion to Ambassador Burns is, well, we have some good friends in Hawaii. It's a place called the East-West Center. I've been invited there as a visiting scholar. Let's have the U.S. ramp up kind of a workshop, not a conference, workshop, hosted at the East-West Institute. U.S. will be present, China will be there, and every claimant nation sitting down at a workshop, and the main contributors to the workshop will be marine scientists and oceanographers with a few, you got to have a few policy experts in there who are special, very few. And we're talking about, you know, taking off your blazers, Explorer blazers, sitting down there, having a workshop and talking about some of these issues I've gone over. I think if Ambassador Burns, if anyone could, suggesting this idea, I floated this informally with the director at the East-West Center. It didn't really I didn't have any traction. I mean, I'm James Borton. Yes, you can be a global journalist in Columbia, South Carolina, but you got to have a little bit more institutional boost to get someone's attention. I'm glad that you've given me your attention tonight, and I've enjoyed this very much. Thank you.
First, thank you to James Borton for an excellent, interesting, and informative presentation on an area halfway around the world that is fraught with problems and certainly, as you persuaded us, deserving of our attention. Secondly, our next program will be held at the Skidaway Community Church on September 21st. That's right, we're talking about 4 months from now. We're formulating our fall lineup of programs, and so please look forward to our announcements. You'll find in front of each one of you a questionnaire, and we ask that you take the time to fill that out. It's an interest survey. Larry, thank you for putting that together for us. And we're looking for not only our ideas among our own council, but the ideas of all of our members as to what your interest will be. It'll be compiled, and we'll use that in developing our programs.
Can you drop it off here?
Yes. Yep. Right there in that box, right there. Okay?
Or online.
Or online, yes. Yes, you can do it online. Each one of you should have received an email that has the same questionnaire. Next, I'd like to thank you, our members, for your continued interest and support over the past 9 months, which is our program year, as we strive to provide you with programs of interest. Just to recap for a second of the programs we presented from September through May, we had President Biden's trip to the Middle East, the importance of Savannah in world trade, how China and the United States compete for soft power, searching for energy security, diplomacy and global challenges in U.S. foreign policy. That presentation had a focus on Turkey. We also had a program on the future of Korea, the war in Ukraine, international and domestic finance, capped with Mr. Borton's presentation on the South China Sea. I appreciate the hard work and the support of all of our directors, our board of directors, but would particularly like to thank Larry Silverman, who heads our program committee, and Doug Eberly, who does such a fine job in producing and distributing our announcements. Now, I'm obviously leaving out the great support of our Vice President, Justin, right here, Justin Gottschall, and the chairs and members of our nominating committee, and there's Susan Terrio right there. Thank you, Susan. Our membership committee, and again, that's Doug back over here in the fourth row. Becky, who right in the first row handles our publicity. Kathy, who's not here, Kathy Ledvina, who handles our communications. Bob Chandis is right here in the fourth row. Thank you, Bob, who really manages a lot of our outreach to different places so that we can hold those programs in acceptable places. Yasik in the front row, who handles our scholarships and our school outreach committees. They keep this council alive and functioning, and my thanks to each and all of you. And then there are a number of other members of the council whom I did not mention tonight, but it's a contribution of all that makes this happen, and I thank you. Volunteers all, they will be working hard this summer to put together our fall and spring lineup of programs. Again, thank you to James Borton, to our members, to our sponsors, and until we meet again in September, I wish you all a fun-filled, safe, and healthy summer, and a good night. Thank you.